On September 19, 2025, the United States was jolted by a dramatic announcement. From the East Room of the White House, former President Donald Trump signed an executive order declaring a total suspension of immigration from Burkina Faso. In the same stroke of his pen, he warned that within 90 days, by December 18th, all student and work visas for Burkinabe citizens would be revoked. For the more than 12,000 people from Burkina Faso living legally in the United States, including approximately 5,300 students in New York, Texas, and California, the news struck like a thunderclap. Families feared separation, universities braced for disruption, and an entire community was thrust into uncertainty. Trump justified his decision not on domestic crime statistics or border policy, but on geopolitics. He pointed directly to Burkina Faso's recent foreign agreements with America's great rivals. On June 28, 2025, Ouagadougou signed a $3 billion gold mining agreement with China's National Gold Group, giving Beijing access to one of Africa's richest mineral reserves. Just weeks later, on July 15, 2025, President Ibrahim Traoré concluded a $1 billion defense pact, with Moscow welcoming Russian military advisors into the Sahel. To Trump and his inner circle, especially immigration strategist Stephen Miller, these agreements were unmistakable signals that Burkina Faso was abandoning the Western orbit and embracing a new axis of power. Standing before reporters, Trump declared, "The United States will not reward those who strengthen our adversaries." His administration moved swiftly. By nightfall, the Department of Homeland Security had instructed consulates in Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey to halt all new visa processing for Burkinabe citizens. What had begun as a political order was already becoming a human crisis, setting the stage for the fierce backlash that would soon follow. Within hours of the announcement, the streets of Ouagadougou filled with people. Some carried placards that read, "Education is not a weapon, and Africa deserves respect." Others waved the green, red, and gold flag of Burkina Faso as they gathered outside the embassy. The atmosphere was tense, but it was also electric, a mixture of fear, defiance, and pride. President Ibrahim Traoré, dressed in his familiar military fatigues, addressed the nation from the presidential palace. His voice was steady, his tone unflinching. "This executive order is nothing more than disguised punishment," he declared. Once again, Donald Trump shows contempt for Africa, just as he did in 2018, when he called our nations holes. Let me be clear, Burkina Faso will never kneel to such insults. The words ignited something deep in the national consciousness. For students who feared losing their futures in America, Traoré's defiance gave voice to their anger. For families worried about their children, it offered reassurance. And, for the nearly 70% of Burkinabe citizens under the age of 30, it transformed humiliation into a rallying cry. Chants of Vive Traoré echoed into the night. Civil society groups, teachers, and youth leaders organized marches in solidarity, demanding dignity and sovereignty in the face of Washington's decree. The ripple effects quickly spread across the Sahel. In Bamako, Mali's interim president, Assimi Goïta, issued a statement calling Trump's order an affront to all of Africa. In Niamey, Niger's military-led government echoed the same sentiment, pledging full support for Ibrahim Traoré. Together, the three nations already bound by the Sahel Alliance formed in 2023 presented a united front. The African Union convened an emergency virtual meeting on September 21st. Leaders from Ghana, Senegal, and South Africa condemned the decision as both unjust and short-sighted, warning that it risked alienating an entire generation of Africans. International media amplified the story. Africa News described the moment as a turning point in Africa's modern history. BBC Africa framed it as a clash between two worldviews, one rooted in sovereignty and dignity, the other in unilateral security. Social media magnified the outrage even further. The hashtag #AfricaNotWhole trended across the continent, amassing more than 1.5 million mentions in just 24 hours. Posts from Burkina Faso students stranded in the went viral, sharing stories of heartbreak and uncertainty. One engineering student in Texas wrote, "I left Ouagadougou to study and bring back knowledge. Now I may be forced out. Do they see us as threats or as people?" The world was no longer watching quietly. From the streets of Ouagadougou to the digital platforms of Africa's youth, the crisis had become both a political battle and a cultural movement. For the 5,300 Burkina Faso students enrolled in universities across America, the order was not just an abstract policy. It was the abrupt collapse of carefully built futures. Emails from admissions offices began arriving, warning of potential visa cancellations. Professors expressed uncertainty about whether students would be allowed to complete their courses. Anxiety spread through African student associations from New York to California. At Columbia University, half of the Burkina Faso student group reported receiving official notices within days. In Ouagadougou, parents lined up at the Ministry of Education desperate for answers. Mothers wept as they described years of sacrificed tuition payments, travel expenses, and the dream of American degrees swept away by one stroke of a pen in Washington. Fathers called into local radio stations to share their heartbreak, voicing fears that their children would be forced to return without diplomas or prospects. The economic stakes were equally severe. Burkina Faso receives roughly $150 million annually in remittances from its diaspora in the United States, a crucial lifeline for local families. Economists warned that the sudden cutoff could shave 1 to 2% off national GDP within a year. Small businesses that relied on dollars sent from relatives abroad braced for collapse. For many, the crisis was not just about visas. It was about dignity, survival, and the value of sacrifice in a world where Africa's youth too often paid the price of geopolitics. Inside Burkina Faso's government, the shock hardened into resolve. Foreign Minister Karamoko Jean-Marie Traoré convened an emergency session with security and education ministers. Proposals were floated to suspend based aid programs, and whispers of expelling American contractors from infrastructure projects grew louder. In Parliament, opposition lawmakers debated whether the country could afford to alienate Washington. Some argued that retaliation would cost Burkina Faso vital support. But Ibrahim Traoré's administration framed the crisis as a matter of sovereignty, not convenience. If we cannot defend our children's dignity, then what is the worth of independence? One ruling party lawmaker asked on the floor. Civil society leaders rallied behind the president, seeing in him an unflinching voice against humiliation. Traoré's fiery speeches elevated his stature beyond Burkina Faso, painting him as the young soldier president who dared to confront the United States. In the countryside, murals of his face began to appear on walls, alongside slogans of unity and resilience. The crisis had begun as a visa dispute. It was quickly becoming a test of national survival and political identity. For Burkina Faso, the question was no longer just whether its students could remain in America. It was whether the nation itself would bow or stand tall in the storm. In Washington, reactions to the executive order broke sharply along partisan lines. Republican lawmakers applauded Trump's decision, framing it as a bold defense of national security. Some echoed his language, portraying Burkina Faso under Ibrahim Traoré as a Trojan horse for Russian and Chinese influence in Africa. Conservative commentators on television argued that closing the doors to hostile states was essential to safeguard America's borders. Yet, opposition voices rose quickly. Democratic leaders, including Senator Cory Booker and Representative Ilhan Omar, condemned the order as discriminatory and strategically reckless. "We are not isolating Russia or China with this policy," Omar declared on the House floor. "We are isolating young African students, workers, and families who believed in America's promise." Universities also joined the chorus of dissent. Administrators from Harvard, Columbia, and the University of California system issued statements, warning that expelling Burkina students would not only harm academic programs, but also erode America's reputation as a destination for global talent. Professors circulated petitions emphasizing the contributions of African students to fields ranging from public health to engineering. The business community voiced unease as well. The Chamber of Commerce reminded policymakers that American companies operated in mining, energy, and telecommunications sectors across West Africa. Cutting ties with Burkina Faso, they warned, would open the door for Chinese firms eager to capture contracts worth billions. Editorial boards at major newspapers echoed the concern. The New York Times described the order as a blunt instrument wielded in a delicate arena. The Washington Post questioned whether it was truly about security or merely political theater in advance of the 2026 midterms. Across the Atlantic, European leaders reacted with caution. EU Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell urged restraint, warning that Washington's heavy-handed approach risked fracturing Western unity, just as Russia and China were expanding their reach. France, already forced to withdraw its troops from Burkina Faso under Traoré's leadership, expressed muted concern. French media admitted that while Paris shared worries about Russian influence in the Sahel, Trump's immigration ban might drive the region even further from the West. In Moscow, officials welcomed the fallout. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov praised Burkina Faso's defiance and signaled readiness for deeper cooperation. State-run media portrayed the crisis as proof that Africa was breaking free from Western hypocrisy. In Beijing, the Global Times celebrated the $3 billion gold mining agreement as evidence that African nations preferred reliable partners over conditional friendships. Meanwhile, the African Union issued a joint communiqué denouncing the decision as unjust and counterproductive. Leaders from Ghana, Kenya, and South Africa voiced solidarity with Ibrahim Traoré, framing him as a defender of African dignity. Across the Global South, commentators in Brazil and India drew parallels to past Cold War strategies, suggesting that Washington's missteps could accelerate a multipolar order. For much of the world, what Trump had presented as a defensive measure looked more like overreach. Instead of isolating Burkina Faso, America appeared increasingly isolated in its approach. Just when it seemed that Washington had cornered Ouagadougou, the diplomatic stage shifted. On October 10, 2025, Burkina Faso announced a sweeping trilateral pact with Russia and China. The agreement covered defense cooperation, gold mining technology transfer, and most strikingly, education. Under the deal, 10,000 Burkina students would be granted scholarships to study in Moscow, Beijing, and Shanghai, with guaranteed funding for a decade. For decades, the United States had positioned itself as the destination of choice for Africa's brightest minds. Yet, in one decisive move, that narrative unraveled. What Washington had closed off Moscow and Beijing opened wide. The same students once dreaming of Harvard or Stanford began to imagine futures at Moscow State University or Tsinghua. The insult intended as punishment became an invitation to new alliances. For President Ibrahim Traoré, the pivot was more than policy, it was political triumph. In Ouagadougou, murals of his face appeared on street walls, placing him alongside figures like Nelson Mandela and Thomas Sankara. Supporters hailed him as the young leader who had turned rejection into renewal and insult into inspiration. International analysts admitted what many in Africa already believed: Trump's executive order had backfired. Instead of isolating Burkina Faso, it had elevated Traoré into a symbol of sovereignty and defiance. His words, "We do not ask permission to be free. We rise to claim it," echoed across the continent, embodying not only the voice of Burkina Faso, but the awakening of a generation. By the end of 2025, what began as a stroke of a pen in Washington had become something far larger. The immigration ban meant to isolate Burkina Faso had instead reshaped the global conversation. In Ouagadougou, Families once fearful of losing their children's futures now spoke with pride about a president who turned crisis into opportunity. Across the Sahel, leaders from Mali to Niger rallied in solidarity, forging bonds that only deepened the region's resolve. For ordinary Burkinabe citizens, the pain was real. Students uprooted from American classrooms faced sudden uncertainty. Parents who had saved for years saw their sacrifices shaken. Yet, from that pain emerged a deeper conviction. Dignity is not given by another nation, it is claimed by one's own. In this crucible, President Ibrahim Traoré rose as more than a head of state. He became a symbol carrying forward the legacy of leaders who once dared to say Africa would no longer kneel. The broader world also took notice. Some in Europe worried America was handing Africa to Moscow and Beijing. In Washington, debates raged over whether national security had been strengthened or America's credibility weakened. But in Africa, the message was clear. Traoré had turned humiliation into unity, rejection into renewal. He had declared with unshaken resolve, "We do not ask permission to be free. We rise to claim it." The story is not finished. It continues in every student boarding a plane for Moscow or Beijing instead of New York. It continues in every young African who believes sovereignty is not a dream, but a right. And it continues in every voice that dares to say Africa will no longer be spoken for, it will speak for itself. If you believe that the courage of Ibrahim Traoré is Africa's true voice, share this story. Subscribe to join the journey of an Africa no longer bowed, but standing tall. God bless Africa.